The essential problem that Greece reflects is that in October 2008, when the world financial system blew up finally, instead of the governments of the world implementing the only solution that would have worked, which is Lyndon LaRouche's solution for a bankruptcy reorganisation of the system, where the toxic bad debts that has crippled the world's financial system and Australia's for decades were finally written off, and the system reorganised along the lines of regulated Glass-Steagall arrangements that Franklin Roosevelt implemented in 1933. Instead of that being done, the central bankers of the world directed the world's governments to bail out the system. Now, in doing this bailout, it had the effect of transferring the debts and the bankruptcy of the private banking system onto the governments themselves. And because we're in a globalised financial system, we're in a situation where you're seeing all kinds of governments start to become crippled by that debt burden that they have taken on, and that's reached a crisis point. That crisis point is not limited to any one country, thanks to globalisation. If any one country defaults on its debt, it'll trigger a global crisis and a chain reaction series of collapses. But here's the problem to consider. When it was banks collapsing in a chain reaction in September and October 2008, it was governments that did the bailout. Now that it's governments collapsing, who's going to bail them out? Well, I'll come to that in a moment. But first, let's look at Australia's situation. The Australian government reacted hysterically this week when, as the shadow finance spokesman, Senator Joyce, made the observation that if Australia keeps borrowing the way it's going, it will be soon in the same position as Greece in not being able to pay back its debt. Immediately, the government, the media, and even the opposition, even Senator Joyce's own colleagues, reacted to that and hysterically denied it. Now, experience has taught us in the CEC, when you see that kind of unified reaction, something's up, right? There's a true picture that they're really trying to hide. And the true picture, as Craig Isherwood said in his press release, Barnaby Joyce turns out to be wrong about Australia's debt crisis. It's worse. So let me give you some figures of the true state of Australia. First of all, Australia's public debt, that is the Commonwealth government debt, is currently around $122 billion. Now that translates into 10% of our gross domestic product. The government has been waving that figure around all week because that contrasts favourably with the rest of the world. In fact, by that measure, we are so far ahead of the rest of the world, it's not funny. We are easily the least indebted country in the world. The average debt held by most other countries is well over 50% of their gross domestic product. And countries like Greece that are in default crisis are at 95+% of their gross domestic product. So a 10% GDP debt in Australia is not seen as a problem. However, look at the rest of the picture. To say that that means Australia doesn't have a debt crisis is to ignore the rest of Australia's debt, which I'll just go through some of the figures. Australia's national foreign debt, which is the total amount of money owed overseas by every entity in Australia, is $1,232 billion, which is 100% or over 100% of our gross domestic product. Australia's household debt, everything that households owe, is $1,200 billion or 1.2 trillion, 100% of our gross domestic product. By those two measures alone, we have a serious debt problem in Australia. Now, without making this the issue of today's briefing, one of the reasons Australia's foreign debt, private foreign debt, is so high is because after 20 years of privatisation and those types of policies by government where they have outsourced and privatised all their responsibilities, all they've effectively done is shifted the government debt onto the private sector. So, and it's a huge problem. Anyway, let's look more closely at the foreign debt figure. Of that $1,232 billion, $1.232 trillion, Australia's banks and financial institutions owe $827 billion of that. And then here's the bottom line. Of that $827 billion, $441 billion of that debt has a maturity of less than 90 days. So this is money that our financial institutions borrow on very short terms, 90-day terms, to lend into the Australian market. And that has blown out to $441 billion. That is unpayable. Now, why is that the issue? Because in October 2008, in order to save the banks from bankruptcy, and that's what was on the agenda, bankruptcy, the federal government stepped in and went guarantor for our financial institutions' liabilities. That guarantee had two parts. It guaranteed the deposits in the banks up to $1 million. Well, our deposits in the banks are those banks' liabilities to us. That adds up to something in the order of $700 billion. The federal government also guaranteed the money that our banks borrow from overseas. A big chunk of this $827 billion. Now, in the time that they've guaranteed that guarantee last week, it was announced, has now been lifted. It'll be lifted by March. In the time that guarantee was in place, under the guarantee, Australia's banks borrowed over $140 billion. Now, even though the guarantee has been lifted, because the federal government went guarantor for that money, it still is guarantor for that money that was borrowed in the last 12 or so months. Right? So that's $140 plus billion added on to $700 billion in deposits. That's what our government is guarantor for, over $840 billion. That's a lot more than $100 billion. But you say, oh well, that's just a guarantee. That's not the government's debt. Well, that assumes that those banks are sound. That assumes that the government is correct when it says it didn't do it to save the banks, it did it as a show of confidence in the banks, to prove they were sound. That's what that assumes. But if those same banks, if Australia's banks that are supposedly so sound, have $441 billion in short-term debt, less than 90 days, they can never pay that back. You can't pay debt like that back. And they don't pay it back. They roll it over. They're continually rolling that debt over when it matures, and they borrow more to roll it over. So in other words, the government's confidence is not in the banks. The government's confidence is in the international money markets, that in their ability to keep rolling over that debt and allowing our banks to roll that debt over. Well, that confidence was shattered in October 2008 when the interbank lending market collapsed. They've been trying to get it back. Well, with the Greek crisis, and if it's not Greece, it'll be Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Italy and even the United Kingdom and the United States, that whole international money market is about to be blown up. Interest rates are going to start going through the roof, etc. And our banks, with this kind of short-term liability, are going to be caught out by that. But if they're caught out, it means the federal government's caught out because they're guarantor for it. And if they're caught out, it means the public's caught out. And so, in conclusion, this is the answer to the question of who bails out the governments. The only people that can bail out the governments are the people themselves. And it's what's happening in Europe now. It's what governments around the world are talking about. It's called austerity. The living standards of the people have to be sacrificed and looted to bail out the governments that are bankrupt because they bailed out the banks. Wages slashed, pensions slashed, social services annihilated, etc. Cut to the bone in order to do that. That's what they're demanding in Greece now. That's what they're going to be demanding Europe-wide. That's what they're foreshadowing in the United States. That's what they're even foreshadowing here for Australia. That's the context in which Kevin Rudd has raised this alarm about Australia's ageing population crisis. That is what's on the agenda. All because they didn't listen to Lyndon LaRouche in 2008. So what's the real solution to this? Go back to what LaRouche said. The debt in the system is terminal. It's got to be got rid of. You can't pay it back. You've got to write it off. Get rid of this toxic debt, thoroughly reorganise the system in the context of a bankruptcy reorganisation and go back to a government-regulated system, not a monetarist system, a credit system that can put the new credit in the economy into the areas that revitalise the economy, industry, infrastructure, etc., and get real wealth being created again. That's the only solution. So this has been a breaking news report for Australia Unshackled. I'm Robert Barwick. Thank you very much.